Welcome. Today we're taking on something really significant. We're immersing ourselves in excerpts from Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't just, a history lesson.
Yeah.
It's about getting inside the journey of this incredible figure, really, through his own words.
Absolutely. And we've pulled out some specific passages, key moments, and reflections directly from the text itself. The idea is to help you navigate this, to sort of pinpoint the insights and experiences that really forge who Mandela became,
Yeah.
how it shaped his politics, and, well, ultimately changed a whole nation. It's less about a strict timeline and more about grabbing those really potent nuggets of wisdom from his story.
Exactly, like tracing where that strength, that resilience came from. So let's jump right in. He starts quite powerfully with his father.
He does. Gadla Henry Mfakaniswa, the chief of Mvezo. And right away, there's this striking example of principle. Mandela talks about how his father lost his chieftainship over, well, a dispute with the magistrate.
Right.
It was about an ox, I think. But the point was, he stood his ground against colonial authority, even though it cost him. On principle.
And Mandela explicitly writes, he says he believes this strain in his character, that defiance, was passed down to him. It's right there, page 1, almost a foundational thing.
Yeah. And his early life in Qunu, he paints such a vivid picture, doesn't he? This sort of clustered village, no real roads, just paths.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions the women and children in these ochre-dyed blankets, contrasting them with the few Christians in Western clothes. It's a very traditional communal world. Land owned by the state, communal grazing.
He even talks about childhood stick fighting and how the skilled fighters were admired like generals. It shows this early value placed on leadership through action, even in games.
And the different stories he heard his father telling tales of his Xhosa warriors, history, battles, while his mother prepared the evening meal, kind of different spheres of influence shaping him.
He also brings up the Amamfengu, refugees from the Mfecane Wars.
Mm-hmm.
He notes they did jobs others wouldn't, worked on white farms. But also, because of that contact, they were often more westernized, more educated, providing clergymen, police. It's an early look at the complex social layers.
Yeah, it's not simple. And then there's that moment he leaves for Mkwekizweni, his mother's farewell. It's so understated.
Just brace yourself, Bull.
Exactly. Ukino Sifakotho Kwedini. No big emotional scene, just, as he remembers it, a tender look. But what powerful words for the life ahead. And school. He mentions teachers taking an interest, but he puts his success down to doggedness, not just being clever. His aunt apparently reinforced that idea. You see that work ethic starting early.
And a really key experience there attending the regent's meetings.
Oh, yeah?
He actually calls it democracy in its purest form. Everyone gets to speak chief, subject, warrior, medicine man. The regent only speaks at the start and near the end.
That must have been incredibly formative for his later ideas about leadership, about consultation, right? Hearing everyone out.
Definitely. And Chief Joy's stories, too. Initially, Thembu heroes, but then broadening out to wider African history. And, crucially, Mandela notes Joy railed against the white man. Another seed planted there.
Then there's the whole circumcision ceremony at Taihalara, a very sacred traditional passage to manhood. He describes the seclusion, the rituals, the fire with wet wood for healing smoke. It shows how deeply embedded he still was in that traditional world.
Because the regent's plan for him was clear then, wasn't it? Be a counselor to the Thembu king.
Exactly. Groomed for traditional leadership.
And Mandela writes that at that point, his horizons didn't extend beyond Thembuland. Being Thembu was the most enviable thing. That strong tribal identity is so important to understanding his later evolution.
Which starts to shift, really, when he goes to Healdtown, the Wesleyan College, in 1937.
Right, a real British outpost kind of place.
Yeah, he talks about Dr. Wellington trying to make them into black Englishmen, a phrase he notes was used derisively, this idea that everything English was inherently superior. A total contrast to Qunu.
It sounds pretty strict. 6 a.m. bell, dry bread.
Mm-hmm. But it's also where he gets into long-distance running. And he writes something quite revealing there, that he learned diligence and discipline compensate for lack of natural ability.
And he says he applied that lesson everywhere. That focus, that sheer hard work, it keeps coming up.
And there was that speech by the poet Makwai. It fired him up about African unity, but also confused him, pulling him back towards a sort of specific ex-Xhosa pride. So leaving Healdtown, he says he still saw himself as a Xhosa first and an African second. The identity is still evolving.
Which continues at Fort Hare University College, the place he calls a beacon for African scholars across the continent. like an Oxford or a Harvard.
He keeps up the running, applying that same discipline. He writes how in cross-country, training counted more than intrinsic ability. That same lesson again.
But then comes that SRC boycott. A major test.
Yeah, students were unhappy about the food, wanted more power for the Student Representative Council. They vote to boycott elections, and Mandela's caught, isn't he?
Right. Stand with the students, risk his whole future, or compromise. He describes that tension.
And in the meeting with the principal, Dr. Kerr, he makes his choice. He writes, he told Kerr he could not in good conscience serve on the SRC like that.
And boom, expelled. It's such an early, clear example of him choosing solidarity, choosing principle over his own career path. Foreshadows so much.
Definitely. And right after that, he's facing another huge personal choice, the regent's arranged marriage plans.
Suddenly, it's not theoretical anymore. Bride chosen, lobola paid, it's happening.
So he and his cousin Justice decide to run to Johannesburg, the city of dreams, he calls it, a place to remake yourself.
Though looking back, he admits they did not exhaust all the options. Maybe they could have negotiated. But the feeling then was just escape.
They get there, see the city of light, but then reality hits pretty quick. They get turned in at Crown Mines after trying to bluff their way into jobs.
He writes about feeling ashamed and humiliated, but also totally determined not to go back.
So in the city, he starts working as an articled clerk, Sadelsky and Eidelman, studying law at night. Meets Gaur Radaby, this older clerk, fluent in languages, who becomes a bit of a guide.
And his boss, Sadelsky, gives him this warning, right? Avoid politics. It will poison your mind.
Yeah, focus on being a lawyer. And Mandela says he initially agreed.
But it's already too late, in a way. His perspective is shifting. He writes about realizing that a degree didn't automatically make you a leader, that his royal background didn't guarantee respect in the city.
Exactly. A good career, a salary, that wasn't the be-all and end-all anymore. He says he was drawn into the world of politics because I was not content with my old beliefs.
And Johannesburg taught him something else, too. Practical experience. Common sense often mattered more than degrees. He points to leaders like Walter Sisulu, who never went beyond Standard 6. A big lesson after Fort Hare's academic focus.
His time at Wits University is also interesting, attending classes with white students, the only African in the law faculty then. He saw Wits as more liberal than the Afrikaans universities.
But ultimately, what really cemented his path was just the daily reality of racist laws.
Oh yeah, constant.
Africans-only signs, the pass laws, the constant threat of arrest. He writes powerfully about how these laws cripple his growth, dim his potential, and stunt his life.
And he stresses it wasn't some single moment of revelation. It was, in his words, a steady accumulation of 1,000 slights, 1,000 indignities, and 1,000 unremembered moments. That accumulation built the anger, the drive to fight back. He says he found himself doing it because he could not do otherwise. It wasn't just politics, it was personal.
This pushes him further into organized politics.
Okay.
He gets introduced to the Communist Party, finds their class analysis intriguing, but maybe not quite the right fit for South Africa at that time. Still, he listened, learned.
And then in 1943, the formation of the ANC Youth League. It was a reaction, wasn't it, against what they saw as a tired, unmilitant, privileged African elite running the main ANC.
Their mission, he says, was to light a fire under the leadership.
A key debate inside the Youth League, led by figures like Lembede, was about Africanism, this idea of racial exclusivity. Should they work with sympathetic whites, Indians, communists?
And Mandela's initial stance. He writes he was firmly against allowing non-Africans into ANC structures. He feared they'd dominate because of their superior education, experience, and training. It shows a kind of pragmatic caution early on.
He gets elected to the Transvaal executive in 47, and he mentions having to move a no-confidence motion against someone he knew, facing that conflict between duty and personal loyalty, principle winning out again.
Then everything changes in 1948. The National Party wins. Apartheid becomes official policy.
Its whole premise, he writes, was that whites were superior. Its function, to entrench white supremacy forever. And that slogan, die with mon modet altid baswis, white mastery, Baskap.
And they didn't waste time. 1950 sees those cornerstone laws. Population registration, classifying everyone by race. The Group Areas Act, which he calls the very essence of apartheid, carving up cities. It's shifting from just taking land by force to locking it down with legislation.
So the ANC responds, embarks on this unaccustomed and historic course mass action.
The Defiance Campaign, 1952, a joint effort with the South African Indian Congress. He's appointed volunteer-in-chief. He describes these huge rallies, speaking to thousands, calling it the most powerful action ever undertaken by the oppressed masses.
And that leads to his first arrest during the campaign. Caught after curfew, he recounts the officer saying, "No, Mandela, you can't escape."
The campaign definitely boosted morale, showed their power. June 26th becomes Freedom Day. He writes about feeling exhilaration and the sense of comradeship.
But the state hits back harder. Banning orders become a key tool designed to just isolate leaders, remove the individual from the struggle. He gets his first ban after the campaign.
Yet despite the ban, he's elected president of the Transvaal ANC in '53, a symbolic move, really highlighting the injustice.
The strategic debates within the ANC were ongoing, though. He notes that nonviolent resistance kind of depends on the other side playing by similar rules. If you're met with brute force, its effectiveness plummets.
And he admits his early view was quite blunt. Nonviolence was a strategy, not a moral principle. He says there is no moral goodness in using an ineffective weapon. Apparently, the NEC severely reprimanded him for saying it so plainly. It shows the internal tensions.
Then you have the Sophia town removals in 1955. Just brutal state power on display. Thousands of police, army, sealing off the area, houses bulldozed.
The ANC helped some families get out, but they decided against violent resistance. Mandela felt betrayed, but writes that violence then would have been an act of suicide. They just weren't ready. A really tough call.
And the Bantu Education Act from '53? Utterly sinister. For Ward's explicit goal, as Mandela saw it, was training Africans only for menial jobs, locking in perpetual subordination.
Right. The ANC saw it as an attack on culture, on the freedom struggle itself. He quotes Professor Matthews saying, "Education for ignorance is worse than no education at all." And the funding difference, 6 times more spent on a white child, just laid it bare.
Yet amidst all this darkness, 1955 also sees the Congress of the People adopt the Freedom Charter.
A beacon of hope.
Absolutely. He highlights its core message: people robbed of land, liberty, and peace, but envisioning a future of brotherhood, equal rights, a democratic state without distinction of color, race, sex, or belief. And that powerful, inclusive closing: we, the people of South Africa, black and white, together adopt the charter, setting out the goal.
Also in 1955, he has this fascinating meeting back in Thimbaland, trying to persuade the chiefs, particularly Daliwanga, who is being groomed for Transkei politics, to oppose the government's Bantu authority system.
Kind of ironic, fulfilling that counselor role he was originally meant for.
Yeah. But Daliwanga argues that separate development might be faster, less bloody than the ANC path. He's apparently shocked Mandela doesn't support traditional leadership structures more.
And Mandela's response, as he writes it, is that the government policy was designed to enslave Africans, turning chiefs into paid servants who lost their independence. Daliwanga ultimately sided with the government. It shows how the Bantustan strategy was meant to divide and rule.
His travels that year were also eye-opening in another way, seeing dense forests near Umtata. He writes he saw places a guerrilla army could live and train undetected. The seed of armed struggle is definitely germinating there.
Which brings us to the Treason trial, starting December '56. 156 leaders arrested, basically the entire ANC leadership. He describes being put in a cage in court, the defense protesting they were being treated like wild beasts. They got the cage removed, a small win for dignity.
The trial itself sounds dramatic, protests outside. But personally, it was a terrible time too. Evelyn gives him that ultimatum, her or the ANC. He writes about confiding in Albertina Sisulu, Walter trying to mediate. But then he meets Winnie. Finding hope, a new and second chance, he says his love for her made the trial bearable. It shows the human cost alongside the politics.
And somehow he kept going, trying to keep his law practice afloat, political meetings. He makes that really poignant point. The wife of a freedom fighter is often like a widow, even when her husband is not in prison.
After the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, a state of emergency is declared. He's arrested again, detained in Pretoria, denied law books.
A key moment in the trial itself is when the remaining accused decide to fire their lawyers and defend themselves. He calls it a dramatic gesture to expose the injustice. He and Dumanokle step up to help prepare the defense case.
He gets involved in cross-examining witnesses, apparently surprising some people. He mentions feeling energized by it, even finding some light moments. Technically, as an attorney, he couldn't address the court directly, only instruct the advocate, Dumanokle.
And he makes a point during the trial of acknowledging the tremendous support from communist allies, even though it was risky for the defense. He also gives that interesting answer about one-party states.
Right, when the judge asks. He says it's not about the form, it's about democracy. If a one-party state could best express democracy, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, focusing on the substance, not just the structure.
Then acquittal in March 1961, a huge moment. And his immediate decision, go underground, become, as he puts it, like a fish in the water.
The all-in conference follows, calling for a national convention, threatening a stay-away strike if the government refuses. He admits he had no illusions they'd agree.
And the government's response is massive force, the greatest peacetime show of force. The stay-away is eventually called off. He tells the press it was a success, but crucially adds they are closing a chapter on this question of a nonviolent policy. The state's reaction had forced their hand.
This leads directly to the decision to turn to violence. He talks it through with Walter Sisulu, using that proverb, Sebatana hasek kuomo. Circumstances dictate strategy. A beast isn't a cow.
He spends a whole day discussing it with Moses Kotane of the Communist Party. They agreed to propose it to the ANC National Executive, knowing it would be difficult, especially given Chief Luthuli's deep commitment to nonviolence.
So, born out of that perceived necessity, Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the Spear of the Nation, is formed in November 1961. Its goal, make the country ungovernable, make the creation of a new and democratic society possible.
At a later conference, the link between ANC and MK becomes explicit, MK as the military wing. Partly, he says, to channel militancy responsibly away from the irresponsible acts of terrorism of groups like POCO. Control was key.
Then he undertakes that secret trip abroad in '62. Huge mission. Gets support for MK, arrange training, boost the ANC's international profile.
He gets arrested near Howick on his return. Sergeant Vorster spots him, despite the disguise. Ag, you're Nelson Mandela, and you are under arrest. Just like that.
But the trip itself was vital. He saw the support abroad, Oliver Tambo's crucial groundwork. He calls Tambo the best possible ambassador. Meeting Haile Selassie felt like shaking hands with history. He successfully argues at a major conference that they had no alternative but to take up arms.
So his arrest in August '62 begins the long imprisonment. Pretoria, local, solitary confinement. He describes it as the most forbidding aspect of prison life, where your own mind begins to pull tricks.
Even then, he's thinking strategically, asking to be with other political prisoners, even Paquet leader Sobukwe, to try and forge unity. He believed prison could temper political differences.
He's rearrested while still serving his initial sentence in May '63 under the new 90-day detention law, which allowed indefinite detention, basically torture. This leads straight into the Rivonia trial, October '63. Charged with sabotage, planning guerrilla warfare.
They prepare their defense under difficult conditions, getting food parcels from supporters like Mrs. Pillay. He notes the government was essentially trying the case in the newspapers beforehand.
The trial starts. The indictment is initially thrown out by Judge DeWitt as shoddy, but they're immediately rearrested right outside the courtroom.
When it resumes, the key evidence is that 6-page plan of action found at Rivonia. The defense, led by Bram Fisher, admits MK exists, admits sabotage happened, but argues MK was not the military wing of the ANC. They tried to keep them entirely separate.
And then comes April 20th, 1964, his statement from the dock. He decides to address the court directly before pleading, intending, he says, to put the state on trial. It's over an hour long, a political testament.
He lays out the reasons for turning to violence. It was a last resort against state violence. Nonviolence had achieved nothing. Followers were getting frustrated, developing disturbing ideas of terrorism. MK chose guerrilla warfare as the strategy with the least risk of life.
He reiterates the goal. A democratic, non-racial state. He explicitly rejects using violence to achieve nationalization, saying that was not a policy of the ANC.
And then those unforgettable closing words. The struggle is my life. Fighting against white domination, fighting against black domination, cherishing the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Just incredible.
Absolutely chilling. June 11, 1964, the verdict. Guilty. Sentence. Life imprisonment. Explicitly, no possibility of parole. He describes the sound in the courtroom, the wailing, raising his fist, shouting, Amenla, the crowd singing Nkosi Sikalal Africa. He says the uproar made him almost forget the reality of the sentence, the stiffest sentence yet imposed. And that thought, his expertise, all that experience, now locked away.
Then begins the long Robben Island chapter. Arriving there, feeling like it was another country, spirits snuffed out, the grim reality sinking in, feeling cut off.
But his resolve is instant. Fight inside as outside. He writes, any man or institution that tries to rob me of my dignity will lose. And crucially, he says he never seriously thought he wouldn't get out, never saw life as truly permanent. That inner belief is astonishing.
Conditions were awful, especially early on. Open racism from warders, terrible food, a constant source of protest, that routine of hammering stones all morning, no breaks.
But protests and external pressure sometimes worked. After a visit from Supreme Court judges arranged after prisoner complaints, he acts as spokesman. He details the grievances, political status, food, work, warder behavior.
And he notes the judges listened intently, especially Justice Stein.
The result. He writes that clothing improved, visits increased, study privileges were expanded. It showed resistance wasn't futile, even there.
He tells that story about confronting warder Prince over insults.
Yeah, demanding an apology. He says he told Prince he wasn't inherently evil, just part of an inhuman system. Prince apologizes, but Mandela refuses to shake his hand, storms out, feeling he lost control, calling it a defeat for himself. It shows that internal struggle for discipline.
And writing the memoir itself, around 75, 76, a massive act of secret resistance, collaborating with Kathrada, Sisulu, and Becky, Maharaj transcribing it into that microscopic script.
And that heart-stopping moment when part of the hidden manuscript is almost discovered by a work crew, the risk involved in retrieving and destroying it, just shows the incredible determination to get the story out.
But the text also lays bare the immense personal cost. Being ripped from his family, unable to be his son, husband, father.
It's heartbreaking. He writes about the commitment to millions coming at the expense of the people I knew best and loved most. And that line, as simple and yet as incomprehensible as the moment a small child asks her father, "Why can you not be with us?" Just devastating.
He reflects on how he changed. He wasn't born wanting to be free. He was born free in a limited sense. But those freedoms meant nothing when his people weren't free.
And that desire for his people's freedom, he writes, it animated his life, transformed a frightened young man into a bold one, drove a law-abiding attorney to become a criminal, turned a family-loving husband into a man without a home, forced a life-loving man to live like a monk. That transformation, driven by the struggle, is maybe the core takeaway from his own telling.
In 1982, he and others are moved to Pollsmoor Prison Mainland, a modern building, he says, but with a primitive heart. Still harsh conditions, but different. They're separated from common criminals.
And at Pollsmoor, he gets permission for a roof garden, growing tomatoes, chilies. He calls it one of my happiest diversions, a small escape.
And subtle signs of change begin. The government starts making overtures, visits from Justice Minister Kobe Coetzee, international figures. Mandela sees it as them testing the waters, a prelude to genuine negotiations.
His message to them is consistent, though. Minor reforms are just pinpricks. It's not about swimming pools. It is political equality that we want. He tells them, look, we can't beat you on the battlefield, but we can make governing impossible.
And he rejects P.W. Botha's conditional release offer renounce violence. Zinzi reads his defiant refusal at a public rally. That was a huge moment.
Secret talks then become more formal. Meeting officials, then Coetzee, then a group of National Party figures, he keeps repeating. Violence was a response to state violence. Negotiation is the way forward. He even suggests the ANC might suspend armed struggle if the security forces pull back from townships. But he insists his release alone won't fix anything.
July 1989, he meets P.W. Botha himself, his first meeting with the head of state. They discuss group rights, the NP idea he totally rejects as just a way to keep white domination.
He later advises Botha's successor, F.W. de Klerk, that hanging on to group rights isn't in his interest. When de Klerk asks what he'll do if released, given the ANC is illegal, he says bluntly, then you must simply rearrest me.
He sees de Klerk, though, as different. A true departure, someone they could do business with. And then February 2nd, 1990, de Klerk's speech, lifting the bans on ANC, PKCP, freeing prisoners, suspending executions. He calls it a breathtaking moment. The time for negotiation has arrived.
Planning the release itself is interesting. Mandela wants to just walk out alone, address Cape Town first. De Klerk is a bit unsure, consults others, they agree, walk out with family, address Cape Town. He packs up decades of belongings over a dozen crates, has a final meal thanking a warder.
February 11, 1990. Release day. Walking out with Winnie into just chaos. Cameras like a herd of metallic beasts, he says. The rally at the Grand Parade, greatest thrill of my life. He thanks the international community for the pressure.
But freedom brings immediate challenges. Intense pressure, security concerns, internal ANC debates about sanctions, meeting Chief Buthelezi as Inkatha-linked violence surges.
He writes about seeing Inkatha members with actual weapons, suspecting state collusion a third force. Reports later confirmed police were funding Inkatha. He admits having second thoughts about having suspended the armed struggle.
Which he did formally suspend in August 1990. A controversial move within the ANC, but he argued it was necessary for negotiations, a gesture of good faith that could be reversed.
Negotiations start CODESA, but they break down after horrific events like the Boy Patong massacre in '92. Inkatha attacks, 46 killed, government complicity suspected. Mandela refuses to meet de Klerk immediately. Mass action resumes.
Then, April '93, Chris Huizeni is assassinated by a white extremist. Real fear of race war erupts. Mandela goes on national television, reaching out to every single South African. He calls for calm, discipline, peace. He identifies the killer as driven by prejudice and hate, but insists peace and negotiations cannot be halted. It's a pivotal moment where he arguably prevents catastrophe.
Despite setbacks and ongoing violence, progress is made. An election date is set, April 27, 1994. He describes this simple, profound feeling of casting his own vote.
And then the inauguration, May 10th, 1994. A bright day. He makes a point of reassuring minorities. The struggle wasn't against any group, but against a system. His call for unity. One country, one nation, one people. The dream articulated in the Freedom Charter finally becoming reality.
Wow. Just hearing it laid out like that, drawing on his own words from the text, it really brings home the sheer scale of the journey, the principles tested, the strategies adapted, the unbelievable personal cost.
It really does. You see the constant interplay between his deeply held beliefs, that democratic ideal, the non-racialism, and the harsh realities forcing strategic shifts, like the turn to arms struggle. His ability to maintain that core vision through decades of brutality and imprisonment is just staggering.
And the way he articulates the sacrifice, not just the years lost, but the specific pain of choosing the struggle over family moments. It's incredibly raw and honest in the book.
It is. It forces you, the reader, to grapple with what that kind of commitment actually means day to day, year after year. It's far beyond just political history. It's profoundly human.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About leadership, resilience, the weight of history, and maybe what it takes to truly transform a society and oneself in the process. That transformation, he describes it himself, is just remarkable.
It truly is. A frightening young man into a bold one, he says. It's quite the arc.
Absolutely. Well, we hope this deep dive into these specific excerpts from Long Walk to Freedom has given you some valuable perspective and maybe encourages you to delve into his words yourself.